Good morning, everyone. My name's Max Finlayson. I'm speaking to you from Charles III University in Australia. Those who know Australia, it's on the Murray River, which has received a lot of attention for water management issues. I'm also the immediate past president of the Society of Wetland Scientists. So I'm pleased to be speaking with you from both those positions. My presentation today is entitled The Second Warning to Humanity, Providing a Context for Wetland Management and Policy. I'll explain to you what the second warning is, and then I'll quickly move into the issues of wetland management and policy looking forward. Also, at the end of the talk, we'll have a session, 2 slides I think it is, on roles for scientific societies within the context that I'm talking about. So that will, I think, affect all of us. One aspect of this talk, which may take some of you by surprise, a lot of it is about the social ecological context of wetland management, not just about the science that many of us have been trained in and have been working on for most of our lives. So that social side is as important as the science, is one of the key messages that I'd like to bring into the talk. So the second warning to humanity comes from a paper that a group of us from the Society of Wetland Scientists published in 2018. It was a response to it was a science-based analysis, really, not just a response of key issues, which is derived from the World Scientists' Warning to Humanity. So we're actually taken the issues that another group of scientists have put forward and applied them directly to wetlands. First of all, I'll talk about the World Scientists' Warning to Humanity. What is this? The one we are responding to is the second warning. So what was the first warning? 25 years ago, the Union of Concerned Scientists and more than 1,700 independent scientists produced the 1992 World Scientists' Warning to Humanity. It was a call at that time, remember this is in 1992, to curtail environmental destruction, not just wetland destruction, environmental destruction, and caution that a change in, unless we changed how we manage the world, I'll change the wording there, all life could go extinct. That's taking it to an extreme, obviously, but there were major threats to humanity and other life. It showed that humans were on a collision course with the natural world. We were pushing things too far and exceeding planetaries, as we now call them. We weren't calling them that in those days. It expressed concern about the current impending or potential change or damage involving ozone depletion, freshwater availability, marine life depletion, ocean dead zones, forest loss, biodiversity destruction overall, climate change, and human population growth. Many of you will recognise these terms, all these issues, but remember this was 1992. It proclaimed that fundamental changes in our behaviour were needed to avoid the consequences that our actions would bring. It feared that humanity was pushing Earth's ecosystems beyond their capacity to support the web of life. It pleaded with us to change the way we're doing things, describing how our numbers exert stresses on Earth that can overwhelm other efforts to realise a sustainable future. In other words, we're doing the wrong things rather than enough of the good things. And implored that greenhouse gas emissions should be cut, fossil fuels phased out, deforestation reduced, and the trend of collapsing biodiversity reversed. Now, many of you, I'm sure, will realise that we've reached the point that these people were trying to warn us to avoid. That led the second group, a much larger group, to publish a paper in 2017, the World Scientists' Warning to Humanity, a second notice. We don't often get second notices, but these guys were giving us one, these people. And the interesting part about this, when they published the paper, they had more than 15,000 other scientists sign on to that paper, actually put their signature to it. That figure, I believe, has now reached well over 20,000 and is probably rising even as we speak, from most countries around the world. So what was in this second warning and how does it relate to wetlands? It was the 25th anniversary of the first call, so they're able to look back at the first warning and evaluate the responses. Sadly, with the exception of stabilising the stratospheric ozone layer, humanity has failed to make sufficient progress in solving these foreseen environmental issues, and most of these issues are getting worse rather than better. Most troubling was the trajectory of potentially catastrophic climate change due to rising emissions from burning fossil fuels, deforestation, and agricultural production. So this is getting at the fact that the way we were living, what supporting our modern lifestyles, was actually putting us on a potentially catastrophic pathway. And it would unleash a mass extinction event. The sixth in roughly 540 million years, but the first to be caused by humans themselves. Okay, so with this background of the second warning, a group of us in the Society of Wetland Scientists decided to look at the implications for wetlands. So take the global world warnings for all ecosystems and look at wetlands in particular. A lot of the evidence that we used in the first phase of this look came from the Ramsar Convention's Global Wetland Outlook, which was tabled in 2018 at the Convention's 2018 meeting. It was widely regarded as one of the most important inputs and therefore outcomes from that conference. So the countries who make up the convention recognise that there's a major problem here. Then it's up to them as national governments to take those steps. Our role here was to try and raise some of these issues, to give them the information so they can make the best decisions. So the Global Wetland Outlook was a clarion call in its own right about the degradation of wetlands, the declining availability of fresh water and the consequences of climate change, very similar to what the second warning was mentioning. There is a lot in this, and most of it is not new. As we showed through the first warning in 1992, scientists were talking about these things 25 years ago. So just as some background, the area of wetlands globally is shown here on this diagram, with African wetlands making up about 10% of the known wetland area in 2018, which was 12.1 million square kilometres. Since then, we have improved the estimates. There are not more wetlands, we've just got better at measuring them or better at bringing in multiple sources of data. There's between 15 and 16 million square kilometres of wetland. Unfortunately, while we know what we have there, a lot of these wetlands are in trouble, and natural wetlands have declined. We have measurements, very good measurements going back to about 1970 and globally. This index here, the natural wet index, shows by region. It's very hard to actually see there, but Africa is not quite as bad as some of the other regions, but the trend, look at the right-hand side of the top middle graph, Africa is the orange curve, which is in the middle and is declining at a fast rate compared to some other regions, but not as bad as South America, for example. But globally, we're losing wetlands. Some of the actual figures on this estimate that since 1930, where we have measurements, up to 35% of wetlands have been lost. I just want to caution how we use that figure. This is only where we have data. It cannot be used as a global wetland loss figure because there's many areas where we don't have data, and we know that large wetlands still exist as they did in 1970, at least in the area of wetland. So we have to be careful of this data, but we can confidently say there's been a lot of wetland loss over the last 40 or 50 years in particular. The area of artificial wetlands is not replacing these losses. In either the area is lost, the species populations that are in decline, or the ecosystem services that are lost. We know we're losing wetlands. And this is occurring through a number of ways. We have large individual disasters, which tend to make the news. But we also know that there's lots and lots of smaller losses. So this death by 1,000 cuts is also occurring. We need to take into account both the small declines, one by one, chipping away at the whole lot of wetlands and the species in it, and these large events, which, as I said, get a large amount of media attention. But because we're losing the wetlands themselves, there is no surprise that the Living Planet Index, which is shown here, shows that the populations of many wetland-dependent species are declining. Freshwater species are shown in the blue line, which is showing that freshwater species are in faster decline than terrestrial or marine species. A lot of people don't realise that freshwater species are in worse trouble than tropical rainforest species, for example, just because we don't get the same publicity for it. But we do have a lot of very valid information now. So trends in wetland-dependent species. This breaks down your data into regions and to sub-regions and to different taxonomic groups. If you look at Africa here, red is greater than 25%, which is the bad loss rates. For example, 25% of species in that group are in trouble, or population, sorry. So in Africa, you can see there's a lot of red and orange in those graphs. There's also some data gaps, but compared to the rest of the world, it's much the same. As things aren't quite as bad in parts of Asia as many people expected because of the high populations in Asia. But globally, and in Africa, as we're interested here, we have a problem with the loss of species populations, and the trend is continuing. Just to look at water quality, global data sets again, and again, we need to be careful in how we use global data sets. There are weaknesses in the data, but the overall pattern shows that in many parts of the world, red here is we have high or low water quality, high risk, etc. So the water quality is not good. If you look at Africa, you can see the red areas shown there in mainly eastern and parts of southern Africa, just outside of South Africa. But there's a large number of areas with moderate wetland quality as well, and freshwater quality as well. So basically, globally and across much of Africa, our water quality is also in decline, which affects the wetland species, obviously. Now, coming on top of that, we have these declines. We know we have these declines. We've measured them for many species populations. The data is getting much, much better. Then we have climate change. Climate experts have warned that temperatures have been increasing, as are sea levels. So what does the future hold for wetlands globally, which will be drastically affected by increases in temperature, increased evaporation, and changes in the hydrology? Many parts of the world of interest to us is where the climate will become drier. We already have drought and water supply problems in many of the drier parts of the world. We can expect many of these to get worse. And when assessing this from an ecological point of view, past baseline conditions are less likely to be relevant for the future. In other words, the future will be very, very different to the past. A lot of our environmental monitoring, assessment and management is based on trying to maintain some sort of semblance of what was there in the past. If the basic conditions have changed so much, that may not be relevant because we just cannot do it, or it will take too much effort or too much money to do if we do try. Just on this graph, you can see the temperature increases here. The year 2000 is marked on the bottom right-hand corner. We are in a period of temperature increases. And those of you who may have seen the news last summer in Australia realise the consequences of that. California in the US is also experiencing increased bushfires, which have a devastating effect on a lot of wetland species, as well as other species in the forest, etc. So it's not good news. We don't have good news from the past. We don't have good news for the future. And climate change also will be influenced by extreme events. This is the one that is harder to predict. We do know that large extreme events cause catastrophic problems, and it introduces a lot of uncertainty into our management. So we have these complex systems called wetlands. They're undergoing massive change, and things like storm events, large storm events, will just make that more and more complex when we want to manage to protect people and property and the biodiversity. And as you know, also the media cycle around climate change, we're still hearing a lot of very, very different media comments. We're seeing images, etc., for the Arctic and Antarctic ice masses are breaking up earlier, etc. So we see people in the top right-hand side, Donald Trump dismissing concern about climate change amid the Californian fires. Prince Charles in the bottoms calls for a military-style campaign. I'm not quite sure what that would be, mind you, against global warming. In other words, he's claiming it's important that we need a massive campaign. The bottom right-hand corner media story, I think is one that will make a difference when farmers, the people who grow our food, the people who depend upon climate for their livelihoods so they can help feed us, when they are seeing their costs going up, etc., and they cannot farm to produce the food, then I think some of our politicians and decision makers may take notice when it gets to that economic factor. But by then, a lot of our biodiversity could be in worse trouble. So now, just to return to the actual scenario, the background. I'm sorry it's bad news. I do like to have good news in there. There is good news around the world, but a lot of it isn't, unfortunately. So some of the actions from the second warning to humanity as they relate to wetlands, there's 8 of these. There were more in the paper. I won't try to go through all of them. And this one here, the first one is to prioritise connected, well-funded and well-managed networks of protected areas for a significant portion of the world's wetlands, nationally and internationally. So here, this map here shows, of a few months ago, a bit over 2,400 Ramsar sites, wetlands of international importance, nominated by national governments. So, and this represents 254 million hectares. It's a big figure, isn't it? It is an impressive network of Ramsar sites around the world. And depending on which data you use for wetland area, it does represent about 20% of the known wetland area as addressed by the Ramsar Convention. Be careful again in using those figures. Make sure you describe what you're actually referring to. But you can see on this map as well, the distribution of Ramsar sites is uneven and is not systematic. You see the United Kingdom and Ireland just about disappear under orange dots. They're the same same size dots as we use for all wetlands. So the size of the dot doesn't represent the size of the wetland. But in Northwest Europe, for example, there's a lot of small wetlands have been listed. They are valuable, there's no question about it. In many parts of the world, in Africa and South America, Australia, etc., large wetlands are there and they are important, but it's not coming out on this sort of presentations. But leaving aside the actual size of the wetlands, a large number of these sites do not have management plans, which I see as an indictment of the resolve of national governments to manage their important sites. Remember, these are some of the most important sites in your countries, in our countries, and our governments nominate them but have not put in place, in about half the cases, adequate management processes, which falls outside the objectives of the Ramsar Convention. We should be managing to maintain the ecological character of these sites as the Convention expresses it. So while we have networks, we need to look at the management is a key point there. Second one is to maintain and re-establish wetland ecosystem services where they've been lost by halting the conversion of wetlands to other land uses. We know that land conversion, drainage of wetlands, taking the water elsewhere, etc., changing wetlands into agricultural areas. And my cat just come to say hello. If you can just move him aside a little bit. So wetlands play a critical role in providing ecosystem services and supporting human well-being and livelihoods. This classification of wetland ecosystem services shown here is a fairly standard one nowadays. The Ramsar Convention adopted this in 2005, and as always happens, some people are trying to change the classification. That's not a big issue in my mind. It's just as we get more knowledge and new people come in, we change how we list things. But it does show some of the types of services that are valuable and come from wetlands. Wetlands provide more, in economic terms, more benefits than most forest systems combined. This is done through food, fish, for example, freshwater provision. They're incredibly valuable materials, goods or products that humans need. But also, wetlands regulate our environment and help make life safe for us, in effect, by managing floods, etc., by regulating climates, by looking providing pollination services, etc. And there's a lot of cultural or recreational benefits that people get from wetlands. But while there are multiple wetland services, there are different levels of value across these services, and the beneficiaries are different. So it's very hard to actually put a single value on ecosystem services. We need to look at the local circumstances and the benefits and who benefits locally. If you see here, this graph, or render graph is one way of looking at it, shows the services down the left-hand side, and for different wetland types, it shows a qualitative assessment of their value with the orange, the H symbol, meaning high value, blue meaning moderate, and grey meaning low value, or lower value might be a better way of expressing that. But you see a lot of question marks as well, where we just don't know. But while there may be low values in some of these systems, locally they can still be critically important. So all these services are important. They're all important to someone. How do we manage that? How do we make trade-offs? If we push for one service, we may push out another one. So that management issue comes right to the fore on this. But the first step is recognising these benefits to people. And we need to be careful of the actual data again. We look at this. Wetlands for flood protection, the role of wetlands in flooding varies depending on the location. It's not all good news for us, I'm sorry. Where the wetland is located in the catchment help determine its role in managing floods. In many cases, floodplains provide space for floodwaters, thereby reducing the flood peaks downstream and attenuating flows. This is well known. When we drain the wetlands, when we take the holes out of the landscape, we can increase the rate of flooding downstream. But in the headwaters, they actually supply the water. So a general statement saying that wetlands help ameliorate flooding, they do help, but not all wetlands help equally. And we need to look at the whole water cycle of how we manage water. Because not only do we want to manage flooding, we want to use the fresh water as well, so we need flows. So it's complicated. We need to be careful of how we express these benefits. Wetlands for drought mitigation. This is another important service where wetlands maintain the flow during dry season and droughts, at least to some extent. Many wetlands are seen to act as sponges that fill in the wet season and release water slowly into the dry season, or at least part of the dry season. And many wetlands are seen to recharge the groundwater. These effects are real, this has been measured, but they do not occur in all wetlands. We need to be careful of generalisations and check the evidence almost for each wetland type or each wetland area or valley, etc. So be careful of these generalisations while recognising that these values can occur. An example, some colleagues of mine that took in South Africa, this wetland here, a small wetland in a dry area. The perception was that the wetland is the source of very important dry season river flow. When they actually got in there and measured the flow upstream of the wetland as well as downstream, The wetland itself contributes little to the dry season river flow. The flow is maintained by the groundwater from the undisturbed upper catchment. So the lesson here is that you have to look at the whole catchment and look at the underground water and value or get the relative value of these different parts, and look at the linkages between the rivers, the underground flows, etc., across the valley. This is a small valley, but it's a very illustrative example of where the local perception turned out not to be quite right. Number 3 in the actions, restoring wetland plant communities at large scales. The issue here is the scale. Many wetland restoration efforts are small, but we need to be aware when comparing size and importance or benefits. I'll leave you this question. Does a large area provide the same benefits as many smaller areas in terms of restoration? A lot of our restoration is on small areas for some very obvious reasons, cost and effort that are involved. When planning restoration, particularly at large areas, the cause, effect and practicalities need to be considered. And this is not just technical or scientific issues. It may require new legislation to enable these actions to go on to cross people's property lines, etc., jurisdictional requirements. It may take new forms of collaboration, private and public interactions, including funding, and new forms of governance and monitoring and adaptive management. These phrases and these issues are not new, but it's how we implement them, or in cases we seem to ignore the realities when trying to implement these large programs. This example from Northern Australia shows an example of how we cannot restore some of these large areas. There's 10,000 hectares of mangrove dieback along a very isolated area of coastline. There's very, very few people who live here. Access is extremely difficult by land or by water. And 10,000 hectares is a large area. Mangroves are complex systems. So we have this massive biodiversity loss and ecosystem service loss with offshore fisheries, etc., the nursery effect from mangroves. So while we understand the primary drivers of this are fluctuations in sea level, rising temperatures, changes in rainfall, that's actually been modelled. It hasn't been proven as such. We didn't know this was happening until after that actually happened. It is next to impossible to manage these issues on site. So while there may be a case for restoration, we want to restore these areas, in some cases, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to do it. I hope there's not many of those, but in this case is one that I looked at or helped look at in other parts of Northern Australia, and we similarly could not do it. So this one here, number 4, rewilding. And many of you probably know more about this than I do here. Our rewilding is about bringing back frogs and small animals. In many parts of the world, many parts of Africa, I know full well there are efforts to bring back some of the apex predators, some of the large animals, the herbivores included. So I won't say much more about this, except we do recognise nowadays that the large animals are an important part of our ecosystems. In many cases, we've taken them out. How can we bring them back as a cost factor? And at what rate and speed, and how do we introduce them to get breeding populations which also don't cause other problems? The 5th action is to develop and adopt adequate policy instruments to reverse the loss of wetland animals, overfishing and poaching, for example, and the exploitation and trade of threatened species, which is an increasing problem in many parts of the world. This takes different policies in different parts of the world. The Ramsar Convention has recommended that countries have a national wetland policy of some sort that suits their local circumstances. In 2018, half the countries within the Ramsar Convention reported they did not have a national wetland policy. So we still struggle to get adequate policies for wetlands. And when we do, the other diagram here shows that the arrangements that have to be addressed by policy can be complex or difficult to implement. And this is the avoid, mitigate or compensate for wetland losses cycle, which many countries have been trying to adopt. For climate change, this makes it even more difficult. We are past the avoid stage. We're into the mitigation stage. A lot of people are still trying to avoid impacts from climate change. Climate change is with us. It is here, it is happening. We have examples, we just have to recognise that and manage as we can with that. Another issue which is becoming more and more complex is the urbanisation in most parts of the world. It is increasingly important, it is complex, and managing wetlands in these areas is very, very difficult, and restoration projects are not always successful, partly due to scale, partly due to understanding, partly due to changes in the catchment. Now, urbanisation takes many, many different forms, from large cities to smaller areas where there's increasing population, so the scale of the problem changes, but it is recognised that urbanisation is another factor which is driving the loss of many, many wetlands, and with that, the ecosystem services that those wetlands produce. Number 7 really gets some people excited, not necessarily positively either. It's about promoting changes in diets to reduce the extent of overgrazing by cattle on wetlands. Cattle are an important food product, we know that, globally. Yet overgrazing is a major problem for wetlands. It is how we can manage cattle, how we can manage our food supply and our food chains to try and reduce the impact on at least some of our wetlands. We also know, though, that diets are not just about cattle. The human diet impacts on wetlands. This is the overall consumption and water demands of changing diets. These diagrams here show a illustrative set of diagrams of the daily consumption or the weekly shopping or something of different people in different parts of the world. It is a generalisation, and I'm very wary of my previous comment about being careful of generalisations, but really the Western diet that many people have or aspire to is more water consuming, and overall the food consumption is higher. That has dire outcomes for the environment in many cases. So managing our diet is not just about cattle, as we said on we spoke about in the previous slide. Number 8, this is the last of the actual actions, is increasing wetland education for children and adults, not just children. Adults need this education and awareness as well as the involvement of wider society, including local and Indigenous communities in the management of wetlands. This is really about integrating diverse perspectives and knowledge into wetland management at one level. There's a lot of different knowledge in the world, not just scientific knowledge. Local knowledge can be very, very important. Social sciences are important. Governance systems are important. We need the best knowledge available for the local circumstances. We want to increase the involvement of wider society in these processes and in wetland management. That is participatory approaches, which are really approaches that start by talking to people before we even start asking the questions. It's not about consultation after we think we have a technical solution. That is one way of doing things. It has not worked in many parts of the world. It has worked in some, obviously. But it is increasingly recognised that involving people from the outset is likely to be far more effective, and to improve education, including outdoor education, not just knowledge and sitting down with books, etc., getting people involved in wetlands so they understand and are aware of wetland values and benefits. And this is from, I said before, adults and school children, politicians, and one we often don't talk about, the media need to be brought into this and to be educated as well as help spread the messages. And education, there's many, many different ways of doing that. There's not just one way of doing this. So we've got to find the right ways that suit the audience and the resources available and the time available to actually share messages. And it's the interchange of knowledge that's important. It's not a one-way process. Now, the role of scientific societies. What could scientific societies like the Society of Wetland Scientists and the South African Wetland Society and others do to help overcome some of these problems? We have our science, and we need to do more than just get new science. It's making use of the science and transferring the knowledge that we get from our science, which I see as a couple of the most important points, and probably ones we don't necessarily focus enough on. There are efforts, and some people are very, very good at it. We know that. But there's an opportunity for scientists to raise the profile of wetlands and to initiate discussions at different levels of society, across society, about how to respond and change directions from the development trajectory that most countries have that have led to the current situation, which we showed through the Global Wetland Outlook earlier. It's not just all about, it's not just a narrow view of wetland science, etc. Do we want to conserve, restore and use wetlands, or just do wetland research? I put that there because we have a lot of knowledge which doesn't necessarily get to those who need to make use of that knowledge, or who would benefit if they had access to that knowledge. So it's about science communication as well as the actual quality and extent of the science. Talking to ourselves through our conferences like this one to strengthen our knowledge base and understanding of wetlands and management is essential. We need to share information amongst ourselves, and we need to learn from that ourselves. I think to some extent we are good at that. We need to do more of it, but it's not only that, as many of you would realise. We need to talk to other sectors, those who influence management of wetlands, activities on wetlands, whether it's local communities or government agencies, etc. And we need to do it by going to them. Often we think we can invite them to our scientific conference, and I don't think that is really that successful. We need to go to them, sit down in their settings, whether it's under a tree or in a formal conference room, and talk to them about why they do what they do, and give them advice, talk to them about what advice they need, perhaps, can they do it differently? People who grow food want to feed the world. People who manage water want to supply water for our cities, our urban and water supplies, which is critical in many places, as you well know, or to grow food. We just can't stop them from supplying water or growing food. It's how we can manage those outcomes and activities in relation to the biodiversity issues that are of fundamental concern to many of us, and which help supply the benefits that they want if they can understand that causal link. So we need to do more of this. I think this part is one of the missing bits in the equation towards success. But we also know that constraints are very, very real. As individuals, we cannot do everything. We don't have time. We have job and family responsibilities, etc. And we need to do those well. And we all don't have the same skills to go and do all this. It's not about making every scientist into a better communicator with agencies or with local communities or with international funding agencies, etc. It's about choosing and helping those who have that interest and those skills to do a better job, to do the best job they can do. But within the societies, to bring this back to the scientific societies, I think these aspects are poorly developed. We have become very good, I believe, at talking to each other through PowerPoint presentations. It's changed the way, I know when I was a younger scientist, the way we used to share information. Overhead projector sheets, if you even know what they were on the whole horrible communication tools. PowerPoint and talking, etc., changed in the current circumstances. The pandemic has actually taught us how to use virtual media better. So we have the technology, but not necessarily, it's almost as though our scientific societies have had to be pushed to actually make better use of these. I hope we do make better use of these. It's nice to visit each other. It's nice to see each other. Nice to have a coffee or a beer with each other. But we can't always afford that. And we can do a lot more through these virtual means. And I think our scientific societies, I'd like to encourage also scientific societies to actually develop these and not just stop once the pandemic situation has been overcome. It's also impeded by attitudes that science should remain separate from advocacy. This is one I love, and I put my views on this here. I see this by not advocating for better wetland management. I see this as an abdication of our responsibilities as privileged and educated members of our societies, and is a pathway to further failure. We have the knowledge, we need to share it. Keeping in mind my previous comments, which are valid, not everyone will do that equally. Not everyone is able to do that equally for all sorts of reasons, but we should be encouraging that. And I'd like to see our scientific societies take the lead and provide the mechanism, not to do it for us, but to provide the mechanisms to help us do it. Unfortunately, some countries impose restrictions on civil societies, scientific societies included, to actually limit the amount of advocacy they can do if they wish to get tax benefits, etc. There's all sorts of little rules and twists in some countries, but we can do something. Even when they have those rules, there's something we can do, and we can do it outside the standard scientific societies as well. But we do need to be aware of any local rules and conditions, etc. We're not asking people to break the law to go out and advocate for wetlands. We're asking people to advocate based on scientific knowledge within the rules and procedures of their countries to actually get better outcomes for wetlands and people who get the benefits from wetlands. But overall, I think there's a real need to overcome these limitations and to make more use of our combined knowledge. We have a lot of knowledge across our scientific societies within the individuals, within institutions, etc. There are opportunities, small, large, local, national, self-reinforcing to each other to help spread the word that wetlands are valuable. The second warning to humanity has shown us, the Global Wetland Outlook has shown us that wetlands are in trouble globally. I would like to hope that we could use the high levels of scientific knowledge that we have, high level of wisdom that we get from our knowledge to get better outcomes for wetlands and for society. So to help do that, just a couple of points here. We need to make sure wetlands are included in the Sustainable Development Goals. The new version of these are being discussed at the moment internationally. We need to look carefully at the role of carbon in climate actions. Wetlands can store a lot of carbon. If we don't manage wetlands properly, we can release a lot of carbon to the atmosphere. The extinction crisis, wetlands have a lot of the world's biodiversity. Urban expansion is real. We are increasingly living in urban areas. More than 50% of the world's population is the figure that's often used. And we are expanding our urban areas. Landscape restoration, we need to manage at landscape levels. Wetlands are part of the landscape, not independent of the landscape. Our food, diets and health issues are critical. How do we balance these with nature conservation and with wetland management? Ecosystem services relates to that. It's a way of expressing the benefits we get from wetlands, and etc. So there's a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of thing there. It's not an easy task. And just to finish the Society of Wetland Scientists has two new initiatives which pick up some of these issues. It's an open invitation to anyone to actually join this. We have a new initiative on climate change and wetlands, where we're looking at scientific analyses and syntheses of existing information to make best use of the information, to try and inform management of wetlands under climate change, and to share this information with other people. The second one is a change in emphasis. It's about the rights of wetlands themselves, the rights of wetlands to exist. Now, this raises all sorts of reactions from people, some strongly in favour and some strongly against, unfortunately, in my opinion. But it is a part of the process of considering additional or new approaches. So how do we address these issues we have? Many of our past approaches have had limited success. We need to continue with those. What are some of our other approaches? And the rights of wetlands is one that we're trying to develop as well with a lot of people within the society. If you're interested in these type of issues, or you want to propose other issues that we could work together, please contact us. Thank you very much. I'd like to acknowledge a lot of different people. My vision is that the Society of Wetland Scientists and other scientific societies engage with wetland professionals and wider society around the world to promote wetland research, education and management in support of a sustainable future for all people. Thank you very much.